Let me start by asking you why it is important to include autistic adults in grief and mourning ritual and what might be some barriers to actually doing that.
Right. I would say that the core reasons that it's important to include everyone in grief and mourning rituals, because being in a position of grief and loss, especially losing someone very close to you, is something that it's very hard for people to handle just on their own. And that pretty much every religion and spiritual tradition has a very complex and nuanced way of responding to grief because people are complex and nuanced, and people's religion to faith and to death and grief is complicated and nuanced. And I think that grief in particular is a time when, regardless of what people's connection to their community was or wasn't, people often find that they want to be involved in and supported by a religious community in some ways, especially when they lose a parent. It raises new questions for them. And there's a lot of turmoil in which ritual and competent pastoral and communal response really matters, I think, for everyone. And I think that autistic people are often not given the space to be complex and nuanced people with the full range of emotional, spiritual, intellectual responses to the world in general and grief and loss in particular that everyone has. And being cut off from ritual makes all of that a lot worse, because ritual has space to hold all of that it's hard for people to create on their own. Even in a therapeutic context, there are things therapy is great for, and there are things that are like religious and communal that it's really not a replacement for and that people need access to. And I think that's especially important for people who have often been denied support or access as like fully human, nuanced people. And I think that there's a lot of barriers to full inclusion in ritual, one of which is the same kind of barrier we have to anything, right? Like we as a society have built our social and cultural institutions, including the religious ones, around a pretty narrow range of humans. Like it's often, sometimes it's just been men, sometimes it's been women, sometimes it's been men and women, sometimes there are various other kinds of exclusions, but a lot of this is our institutions and cultural spaces have often been built around the assumption that everyone in the room who matters is basically physically and cognitively the same. And we haven't made space for people who are significantly different from what these norms assume, which there's a lot of different ways that can be problematic. For instance, if your ways of participation involve assuming that people can speak or be in a crowd or sit still or like express emotion using certain kinds of body language or whatever else, if your ritual is built around those assumptions, then a lot of people who are physically or cognitively different from that end up being left out, and that ends up being particularly important in these high stakes moments like grief, especially loss of a parent. And with change is hard in general, but ritual change in particular is very difficult because people are attached to rituals being the way they are.
Sure.
As a way of embodying religious values, as a way of embodying communal connection, tradition, authenticity, and figuring out how to make all of the reasons all of that is important accessible in a way that will be perceived as legitimate by the community gets really complicated.
As a rabbi, if I may, in the Jewish tradition and religion, which has lots of rituals and lots of gathering, how have you been able to adjust those rituals so that they can be more inclusive in these areas that you're talking about?
I mean, I'm a theorist and a research rabbi, so my role is often more in the range of like supporting like supporting other clergy or talking through with other people what they might like to do and what holding grief is like for them. But I would say that one thing I've seen that I think is a potential and power of the Jewish community is there's the immediate funeral, but there's also saying Kaddish for a fairly extended period and observing yortzeits annually. So there's a lot of space for continuing to process grief and continuing to build communal relationships. And I think it's a real power of the tradition, setting it up so like it's never too late for communities to at least partially hold what they should be holding.